The rope snapped taut in Wilhelmina Rourke's frostbitten hands, and she heard the scream before she saw the man. It came from somewhere below the ridge, swallowed almost instantly by the howl of the blizzard that had locked the Sweetwater Valley in a merciless grip for 3 days running. The scream was raw and desperate, the kind that claws its way out of a man's chest when he knows he is facing the end. Wilhelmina did not hesitate. She had not hesitated once in the 32 hours since she had organized this rescue, since she had stood in the middle of Hartwell's general store with half the valley cowering around her, and declared in a voice that did not shake that Tobias Brooks was alive out there in that white hell, and that they were going to bring him home. Nobody had believed her then. Not Hector Price with his red face and his loud opinions about what a widow woman ought to concern herself with. Not old Gus Tamblin, who had worked the frontier for 40 years and claimed he knew when a man was already dead. Not even young Daniel Webb, who had ridden for the Brooks ranch all summer and thought the world of Tobias Brooks, and still could not fathom how anyone survived 3 nights in a valley blizzard. But Wilhelmina had known. She had looked at the evidence, the last direction of the Brooks cattle tracks before the storm hit, the topography she had mapped herself over 2 years of careful study, the prevailing wind pattern she had charted in the leather journal she kept by her bed. And she had known exactly where a man caught in that storm would take shelter if he had any sense, and knew this land the way Tobias Brooks knew it. She had known, and she had gone anyway, and now the rope in her hands was the only thing between Tobias Brooks and a 40-foot drop into the frozen creek bed below the Corbin Ridge. "Hold on," she shouted into the wind, though she could not see him yet through the white curtain of snow. "Hold on, I have you." She braced her boots against the ice-crusted rock, wrapped the rope twice around her forearm the way her late husband Callum had taught her before he died, and she held. That had been 4 hours ago. Now, crouched in the lean-to shelter she had constructed against the eastern face of the ridge while the blizzard screamed outside, Wilhelmina watched Tobias Brooks breathe. He was alive. Frostbitten on 3 fingers of his left hand, carrying a deep gash along his ribs from where he had slid down the rocky face of the ridge when his horse had thrown him on the first night of the storm, badly dehydrated and burning with the early signs of exposure fever, but breathing. Chest rising and falling in the firelight she had coaxed out of damp wood and the last of her sulfur matches, the orange glow playing across the hard planes of his face, the dark beard that had grown heavy in 3 days, the long dark lashes she had not expected on a man that large and that rough-looking. To understand how Wilhelmina Rourke came to be the woman who would throw herself into a blizzard to save a man she had barely exchanged 20 words with, you had to go back to the beginning of that winter. You had to go back to the October morning she had arrived in Sweetwater Valley, trailing her own dark past behind her like a shadow she could not outrun. Colorado Territory, 1879. The Sweetwater Valley sat in a fold of the Rocky Mountain foothills like something cupped in a giant's palm, ringed by peaks that turned white in September and did not release their color until May. It was cattle country, hard and beautiful and indifferent to human suffering in the way that all genuinely wild places are. The town of Hartwell occupied one end of the valley, a general store, a livery, a sheriff's office, a church with a leaning steeple, 2 saloons, a school that doubled as a town hall, and a scattering of homes and businesses that had been slowly accumulating since the first settlers pushed into the valley in 1866. The ranches spread out from there in every direction, bounded by creek land and timber, and the kind of fence lines that men had argued over and occasionally shot each other over. Wilhelmina had come to Sweetwater Valley with a wagon, a mule, a dog named Compass, a trunk of books, and enough surveying equipment to stock a modest professional operation. She was 28 years old, 2 years a widow, and carrying a reputation she had not asked for and could not quite shake. In the circles of the Colorado Territory, people knew her name. She was the woman who had mapped the Crestfall Pass route that the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had ultimately adopted over two competing surveys. She had done it at 25, working alongside her husband Callum Rourke, and when Callum had died of a fever that winter, she had continued alone. She had published the survey under both their names, a gesture of love and grief combined, but anyone who had worked with the couple knew that the precision of those maps, the extraordinary accuracy of the elevation measurements and the water source notations, had been primarily Wilhelmina's work. Callum had been a good man and a decent surveyor, and she had loved him completely. But Callum had always known that his wife saw the land differently than he did. She read topography the way other people read text on a page, with an ease and fluency that was almost eerie. She could stand on a hillside and tell you within 50 feet where water would run when the snow melted. She could study a valley from a ridge and reconstruct the geological history of the place just from the rock formations and the drainage patterns. She had been doing it since childhood, growing up on her father's farm in Pennsylvania, driving her schoolteachers half wild with her refusal to simply memorize geography and her insistence on understanding the underlying physical logic of landscapes. After Callum died, she had spent 2 years completing contracts, building her reputation, and carrying her grief with quiet, private fierceness. The dark past she dragged with her was not dramatic in the way of outlaws or secret sins. It was the ordinary devastating darkness of profound loss, a husband gone too soon, a child she had carried for 5 months and lost the same winter, the particular loneliness of being a woman alone in a profession that men claimed as theirs. She had survived it. She had more than survived it. She had built herself back into something harder and more capable than she had been before, and she had done it without asking anyone's permission. She came to Sweetwater Valley because a man named Patterson had offered her a contract to survey the western pasture boundaries of several neighboring ranches, a long-running dispute that the valley's inhabitants had apparently been unable to resolve with any accuracy or agreement. It was good work, honest work, and the pay was fair. She had rented the old Sinclair cabin at the south end of the valley, moved in her things, and set about making herself useful to the people of Hartwell before the heavy snow arrived and made outdoor survey work impossible until spring. She met Tobias Brooks the way she met most of the valley's residents, in Hartwell's general store, purchasing supplies. He came in while she was studying a bolt of oilcloth and considering whether it was heavy enough for the canvas covers she needed for her surveying equipment boxes. He was an enormous man, broad across the shoulders in a way that made the doorframe seem temporarily relevant, wearing a battered brown coat with trail dust still on it, and carrying the particular focused energy of someone who had spent most of their life outdoors managing large, willful animals. He was 34 years old, she would learn later, though he carried himself with the settled authority of someone older. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same rock as the valley walls, and hands that were so large and work-worn that, when he reached past her for the tin of coffee on the shelf, she instinctively stepped aside not out of deference but out of simple spatial awareness. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was the other surprising thing about him, lower than she expected, carrying a trace of something that was not quite an accent but was a strong regional music, somewhere from the deep southwest she thought, Texas maybe, or New Mexico. "No harm," she said, and went back to the oilcloth. He looked at her for a moment. Women alone in general stores in Hartwell were not exactly rare, but women alone in general stores who were examining materials with the focused professional eye she was clearly applying to that oilcloth were unusual enough to earn a second glance. "You're the surveyor," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "You're mapping the pasture boundaries." "I am." He nodded slowly, something moving behind those dark eyes that she could not quite read. "Tobias Brooks. My land shares a boundary with the Harmon place on the north end. You'll be coming out to my ranch at some point, I expect." "I expect so," she said. Wilhelmina Rourke. He absorbed her name, held out his hand, and she shook it firmly. His grip was careful, she noticed. He had clearly judged the size differential between his hand and hers and adjusted accordingly, which told her something about him that she filed away without comment. They said nothing else. He bought his coffee and his tobacco and his salt, and he left, and she bought her oilcloth, and that was the sum total of their acquaintance for the next 3 weeks. She worked. The autumn was crisp and golden and deeply beautiful, and she spent her days on horseback with her theodolite and her chain and her notebook, triangulating boundary markers and recording elevations, and talking to ranchers who ranged from warmly cooperative to openly hostile, depending on whether they believed the survey would favor their claims. Hector Price, who owned the largest spread in the valley and had a temper to match, had made it perfectly clear on her second day of work that he did not trust her impartiality. He had said it in a way that implied the distrust was connected to her being a woman, and she had looked at him steadily and told him that the mathematics of surveying did not have a gender, and that his boundary line would be wherever the physical evidence placed it. And if he had concerns about that, he was welcome to hire a second surveyor to independently verify her work. And that second surveyor would arrive at the same answer she did, because the land did not lie even when the men who claimed it preferred that it did. Hector Price had gone red in the face and said nothing, which she counted as a minor victory. She rode out to the Brooks ranch on a bright Thursday morning in late October, 3 days before the blizzard that would change everything. The ranch was substantial. She could see that immediately. The main house was a long, low building of dressed timber with a proper stone chimney, surrounded by outbuildings that showed real care in their construction. The fences were solid, the corrals well maintained, the whole spread carrying the look of a place that was owned by someone who intended to stay. There were no children's voices, no woman's touch visible in the curtains of the windows, and she found herself wondering briefly about his story before she reminded herself that she was here to work. Tobias came out to meet her as she dismounted, and he brought his foreman, a compact, quiet-spoken man named Russell Crane, who would assist by holding survey stakes. The work took most of the day. They moved along the northern boundary line together, and she was precise and methodical, and Tobias Brooks watched her work with an attention that she was aware of but did not find uncomfortable, because there was nothing predatory in it. It was the same quality of attention he would have given a man doing the same work, a genuine observation of competence, the assessment of someone who understood that this task mattered and was watching to see if the person doing it was equal to it. At midday, Russell Crane heated coffee on a small campfire, and the 3 of them stood in the cold air and drank it, and Tobias asked her about the survey method she was using, and she explained the triangulation process, and he listened with the focused intelligence of a man who absorbed practical information readily and did not pretend to know things he did not. He asked good questions. She respected that. "You came from the Crestfall Pass project," he said, not as an accusation or a flattery, simply as a fact being confirmed. "I did. That was good work. The railroad route it established saved 2 weeks off the mountain crossing for freight. I benefited from that personally." He glanced at her sideways, not quite a smile, but something in the same neighborhood. "Didn't know it was a woman's work at the time." "Does knowing that change anything about the quality of it?" she asked, keeping her tone even. "No," he said without hesitation. "Just changes my picture of things. I had a picture of who did that work and it was wrong. I'm correcting it." She looked at him. Most men, when confronted with the gap between their assumptions and the reality of her, responded with either dismissal or the kind of aggressive, overcorrected enthusiasm that was its own kind of condescension. He had done neither. He had simply updated his understanding, the way an honest man updates his understanding when he encounters new evidence. "Fair enough," she said. They worked through the afternoon, and she completed the northern boundary measurement and gave him her preliminary findings. His land was exactly where he believed it to be. The boundary markers were correctly placed, and he had no dispute with the Harmon Ranch that could not be resolved by a brief conversation. Nodded, thanked her, and as she was loading her equipment back onto her horse, he said without preamble, "Storm coming, 3 days off maybe, possibly less. The peaks have been building cloud in the west for 2 weeks and the temperature has been dropping faster than it should. I'd get your outdoor work finished before the week is out if I were you." She looked at the western sky. He was right. She had noticed the same signs and had been telling herself she had more time than she probably did. "I know," she said. "I have 2 more boundary segments to finish. Ride out early tomorrow," he said, and the day after. He was not telling her what to do. He was giving her information the way you give information to an equal, the way you share weather intelligence with someone whose safety depends on it. She appreciated the distinction. "I will," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." "Tobias," he said. "Wilhelmina," she replied. She rode home with the last of the autumn sun on her back, and something she had not expected. A small, quiet warmth in her chest that she did not immediately examine too closely, because examining things too closely too quickly was how you convinced yourself of things that were not yet true. She completed her surveys on Friday and Saturday, working fast and accurately, and by Saturday evening she had her field data in order and was back in the Sinclair cabin, with the fire built high, when the first fingers of the storm began reaching down from the mountains. By Sunday morning, Sweetwater Valley was in the grip of something extraordinary, a blizzard that the old-timers would later say was the worst they had seen in 15 years. The kind that came down from the high peaks with a fury that seemed personal, driving snow horizontally across the landscape, burying fence lines and turning familiar terrain into a featureless white anonymity that was disorienting and deadly. She heard the news on Sunday afternoon when a rider from the eastern end of the valley made it through to Hartwell and reported that Tobias Brooks had ridden out Friday evening to retrieve a small group of his cattle that had drifted too far north toward the Corbin Ridge and had not come back. His ranch hands had waited Saturday, thinking he had taken shelter in one of the line shacks, but the line shacks had been checked that morning, and he was not in any of them. His horse had come back Saturday night without him, which was the kind of detail that turned anxious waiting into genuine alarm. She was in the general store when the rider delivered this news. She was there with 6 other valley residents who had gathered seeking company and information in the way that people in storms seek light and warmth. She listened to the report, and she watched the faces around her, and she saw what she had seen before in people confronted with a problem that felt too large, the retreat into helplessness, the comfortable fiction that nothing could be done, the way that impossible circumstances can become permission to stand still. She would not stand still. She pulled out the survey maps she had been carrying in her satchel. She rarely traveled without them, and spread them on Patterson's long wooden counter, and she said, "Everyone listen." They listened, perhaps partly from surprise that a voice that clear and that certain was coming from where it was coming from, and partly because the valley had been waiting 2 days for someone to say something that was not the polite language of giving up. She showed them the maps. She showed them the topography of the Corbin Ridge area, the ways the land funneled and channeled when the wind came from the northwest, the location of every natural shelter she had noted in her surveys, the rock overhangs, the creek-cut ravines, the stands of timber dense enough to break the wind. She had been out in that terrain 4 days ago. It was not abstract to her. She could see it clearly in her mind, even buried in snow. He would have gotten turned around when the storm hit Friday evening, she said, using the stub of a pencil to trace the route on the map. The cattle would have drifted this direction, northeast along the ridge base, because that is where the terrain funnels them. When he could not get back, he would have needed shelter. There are 3 places on this stretch of the ridge where a man who knows this land would instinctively take cover. She marked them. "I believe he is in one of these 3 locations. The most likely is here." She tapped the map, the eastern face of the lower Corbin Ridge, where there is a rock formation that creates a natural windbreak and where I noted a stand of mature spruce trees that would provide additional cover. He has been out 3 nights. He may be injured. He is certainly in danger. We can reach that location if we move carefully, if we rope together, and if we trust the map. Silence. Then Hector Price, because it was always someone like Hector Price. With respect, Mrs. Rourke, you're describing a rescue mission through a full blizzard based on a woman's hunch. She kept her voice very steady. I am describing a rescue mission through a full blizzard based on precision survey data and 4 days of direct observation of that terrain, Mr. Price. Those are different things. More silence. Russell Crane, Tobias's foreman, who had been standing at the back of the room with his hat in his hands and his jaw tight, said quietly, I trust those maps. I watched her work. That moved things. Not Hector Price's objection, but Russell Crane's trust, because the valley knew Russell Crane as a man who did not give his trust lightly. 3 men stepped forward, then 2 more. Then Daniel Webb, and a rancher named Pete Harmon whose land bordered Tobias's, and a young school teacher named Francis Adler who had no business in a blizzard, but volunteered anyway, and was firmly redirected to organizing the warm-up station at the schoolhouse, where the rescued man would be brought. Wilhelmina organized them with the same focused precision she brought to everything. She assigned roles, established a rope protocol, explained the navigation strategy she would use to maintain direction in the whiteout conditions, using the one technique that worked when visual landmarks disappeared dead reckoning from a known starting point using timed distance intervals and compass bearing, pausing every 100 yards to reassess and correct. She checked every man's equipment. She made sure they had rope, and enough of it. If I tell you to stop, you stop immediately, she said, standing in the doorway with the blizzard howling behind her. If I tell you to go back, you go back without argument. We are looking for 1 man, and I will not trade 6 for 1. Is that understood? Nods around the group. She led them out into the white hell. The details of the 2-hour traverse through the blizzard were the kind that embedded themselves in a person's memory in fragments rather than sequences. The numbing cold that moved from uncomfortable to painful, to something past pain, that was simply a constant white noise of the body's distress. The way the wind came in sudden massive gusts that staggered even the largest man in the group. The eerie obliteration of all visual landmarks so that the world reduced to the few feet of snow-blasted visibility around you, and the rope connecting you to the person in front and behind. And Wilhelmina at the front of that rope, consulting her compass in its leather case, checking her pocket watch for distance intervals, reading the ground underfoot with her boots when her eyes could not give her the information she needed, moving forward with a certainty that she held onto partly from knowledge and partly from the fierce, quiet stubbornness that had been her companion since Callum died. She found the eastern face of the lower Corbin Ridge exactly where it should have been. She heard the scream. And then she found the rope, her own rope, the one she had coiled over her shoulder, and she anchored herself against the rock and lowered herself carefully, until she could see through the white and the dark the shape of a man clinging to an outcropping 20 feet below the ridge lip, one hand bleeding, the other locked around a root that was slowly pulling free of the frozen ground. Tobias Brooks, she shouted, a face turned up toward her. Even through the blizzard, through the dark and the snow and the desperate extremity of the moment, she could see the disbelief on it. Catch the rope, she said. He caught it. Getting him up took 15 minutes and the full strength of 4 men and 1 woman who braced herself against that rock face with every ounce of muscle and will she possessed. When he finally cleared the ridge top and collapsed into the snow, the men around her made sounds of relief that were almost like weeping. Russell Crane was actually weeping, silently, his face averted. She was already moving, already organizing the next phase, the lean-to against the eastern rock face, the fire, the shelter from the worst of the wind, while the storm continued its fury overhead. She had learned to build lean-to shelters in conditions just short of this bad, had learned from a trapper named Hayes who had worked with her father when she was 12, and who had possessed the rare quality of teaching without condescension. She built the shelter while the men tended to Tobias, who was drifting in and out of consciousness, registering the world in fragments. She built it well enough to hold the heat of the small fire through the long hours of the night, and she directed Pete Harmon and Daniel Webb to return with 3 others to Hartwell along the rope line they had maintained, leaving Russell Crane and 1 other man, a steady-nerved rancher named Gil Morrow, to stay with her through the night. And so she sat in the lean-to in the firelight, watching Tobias Brooks breathe, listening to the blizzard scream outside, and feeling the particular complicated feeling of a thing that nearly went terribly wrong but didn't. He woke near midnight. Not fully, it was the drifting, fever-touched half-consciousness of someone whose body was fighting multiple battles at once. His eyes opened and they found her immediately, which told her the fever was not so bad that he was lost in it. His eyes were very dark and very direct, and they looked at her across the small fire with an expression she could not name. "You came," he said. His voice was rough and barely audible above the wind. "We did," she said. "I heard you call my name." A pause, long and unsteady. "I thought I was dreaming it." "You were not dreaming it." He looked at her for another long moment. "How did you know where I was?" She thought about giving him the short answer, the practical answer, the survey maps and the topography and the dead reckoning navigation. But in the firelight, with the blizzard locked around them and the intimacy of the lean-to and the rawness that comes when a person has been very close to dying, the short answer felt insufficient. "I mapped this terrain 4 days ago," she said. "I know where a man caught in a northwest blizzard would shelter on Corbin Ridge if he knew this land and had any sense." "You knew this land and you had sense." Something moved through his eyes. The fever gave his face an openness it might not have had otherwise, stripped the habitual reserve that she had noticed in him from the beginning. "You organized the rescue," he said. "Somebody had to. How many came?" 6 total. 4 went back once we got you to the ridge. Russell and Gil stayed." He was quiet for a moment, processing. Then Hector Price didn't come. Despite everything, she almost smiled. "No, he did not. He wouldn't." A cough that she watched carefully, checking for the liquid quality that would indicate something worse than cold and exhaustion. It was dry. "Good. He and I have been." Another pause. "There are things about this valley I need to tell you. Things about why the boundary disputes have been harder to settle than they should have been. Price has been moving boundary markers. He has been doing it for 2 years." She stilled. This was something she had begun to suspect herself, certain inconsistencies in the field evidence, markers that showed signs of having been recently relocated, ground disturbance that did not match the supposed age of the placements. She had been documenting it carefully but had not yet drawn a conclusion she was confident putting in a professional report. "Tell me what you know," she said. He told her. Lying there in the shelter of the lean-to, with the blizzard outside and the fire between them, Tobias Brooks told her what he had suspected and what he had witnessed, what Hector Price had been doing to the smaller ranchers of the valley over 2 years, systematically pushing boundary markers to expand his pasture land at the expense of his neighbors. Knowing that, without a professional surveyor's documentation, the disputes would grind on inconclusively in a legal system that cost more than most of his targets could afford. He had tried to confront Price 6 months ago. Price had come back with a legal threat and a man from Denver who called himself a lawyer and had suggested, with the particular dangerous politeness of a man who means a threat to be understood, that Tobias Brooks would do well to concern himself with his own property. There was the hidden motive, she thought. There was the dark past that had been lurking under the surface of the valley's disputes. Not just a boundary disagreement, but a deliberate, calculating theft of land from people who lacked the technical knowledge to prove what was being done to them. And the timing of her arrival, the professional surveyor hired to finally document those boundaries, would have made her work threatening to Price from the moment he heard about it. "That's why he wanted to make sure no one trusted my work," she said aloud. Tobias looked at her. He's been saying things around the valley, that a woman's survey work can't be trusted in court, that you're likely to favor whoever pays you more, things like that. The anger that moved through her was cold and clean, much less dramatic than the hot fury she might have felt younger. It was the anger of a professional who has had her work undermined not on its merits, but on the basis of who she was, and she had learned to use that anger as fuel rather than as a distraction. "He's wrong about my work," she said. "I have documentation of several inconsistencies in the marker placements that I believe will prove the relocation when analyzed properly. I have been building the case carefully because I needed it to be airtight." Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "He tried to trap you too. He told Patterson, the man who hired you, that your methods were outdated. He was trying to get your contract canceled before you completed the survey." This she had not known. This landed differently, not the anger at the professional assault which she had already accounted for, but the sudden understanding of the full scope of what had been happening around her while she worked. The hidden trap, the forces aligned against her findings before she had even delivered them. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Patterson told me. He came to me privately 2 weeks ago, worried that he'd made an error in hiring you. I told him he hadn't." Tobias's dark eyes were steady on her across the fire. "I told him you were the best surveyor I'd ever watched work, and that if Hector Price was trying to undermine your contract, that was the best possible evidence that your findings were going to be accurate." She looked at him. The fire crackled, the blizzard howled. Outside, she could hear Gil Morrow's occasional movement as he checked the shelter's integrity. "You defended my work," she said, "before you knew me well." "I'd watched you work for a full day," he said. "That was enough." There was a silence between them that was different from the silences that had preceded it, warmer, more freighted with things unspoken. She was aware of herself in a way she had not been in a long time, not the professional awareness of her own competence, which she carried constantly, but the simpler, more disorienting awareness of being looked at by a man who saw her clearly and found what he saw admirable in a way that was not only professional. She looked away first, not from discomfort, but from the feeling that she needed to be careful. She had made herself from the wreckage of a love she would never stop mourning, and she knew the difference between the warmth she felt for Callum's memory and the warmth she was beginning to feel in the presence of Tobias Brooks, and she was not sure she was ready to examine that distinction yet. "You should sleep," she said. "The fever needs rest more than anything else." Wilhelmina, her name in his voice. It was the first time he had used it since the day they met. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for coming out here." She met his eyes then. "You would have died," she said, and it was not an exaggeration, and they both knew it. "I know," he said. They looked at each other in the firelight for one more beat. "Sleep," she said again, gently this time, and he closed his eyes. She sat awake for most of the night, tending the fire, listening to the blizzard, thinking about moving boundary markers and hidden traps and the particular quality of a man who defends a woman's work to the person who hired her, without being asked and without telling her. When the first gray light began to infiltrate the storm's darkness, signaling that the worst of the blizzard was breaking, she woke Russell Crane and they prepared to move. The return journey took 3 hours, the blizzard reduced now to a brutal but navigable condition, and they brought Tobias Brooks into Hartwell on a makeshift litter that his own unsteady legs would not have managed alone. Frances Adler and 2 other women had the schoolhouse warm and ready, had arranged blankets and heated broth, and the kind of organized care that the frontier community managed best when someone gave them clear instructions, which Frances had done admirably in Wilhelmina's absence. The valley came to see him. It came in 1s and 2s and small clusters, people who had known Tobias Brooks for years standing at the schoolhouse door to confirm with their own eyes that he was alive. She watched this from the corner of the room where she had retreated once the immediate medical needs were being managed, watched the valley reassemble around one of its own who had come too close to being lost, and she felt the strange doubled emotion of someone who has just done something large and necessary, and is now watching the aftermath from a slight remove. Hector Price did not come. That absence was noted. She spent 2 days in the Sinclair cabin recovering from the exposure and the effort of the rescue. And she spent those 2 days not resting, but going back through her survey documentation, pulling every notation she had made about the suspicious marker placements, building the written record of her findings into the kind of ironclad professional report that would hold up not just locally, but in a territorial court if it came to that. She had enough. She had known for a week that she had enough, had been waiting only to be completely certain, and now the urgency of completing that report felt like the most important professional act of her life. On the 3rd day after the rescue, with the blizzard finally fully past and the valley buried in 2 feet of fresh snow that sparkled in cold, brilliant sunshine, she rode out to deliver the completed report to Patterson and to the sheriff, whose name was Arthur Kell, and who was a methodical, fair-minded man she had assessed positively in their one brief previous interaction. She laid it all out for them. The documentation of the moved markers, the comparative measurements between her survey data and the record measurements she had found in the original land claims, the systematic pattern of displacement that showed clearly not the random drift of markers over time, but the deliberate, directional movement of markers across multiple properties, always in one direction, always toward the same property line. Hector Price's property line. Sheriff Kell read every word of the report without rushing. He asked 3 questions, all of them good ones, and she answered them precisely. Then he looked up at her and said, "This is thorough work, Mrs. Rourke." "It is accurate work," she said. "The thoroughness follows from that." Kell nodded. He picked up his hat. "I'll be making a call on Mr. Price this afternoon." The legal process that followed was not swift. Nothing involving land claims and territorial courts was ever swift in the Colorado Territory in 1879, but it was thorough, and it ultimately moved in the direction that her evidence pointed. Hector Price, presented with the survey documentation, and the official attention of both the sheriff and a circuit court judge who came through in February, made the eventual decision that most men make when their forced choice is between restitution and prosecution. He agreed to pay a settlement to the ranchers whose land he had taken and to have the boundary markers restored to their correct positions. He did not apologize. He never would. But the land went back where it belonged, and in the Sweetwater Valley that mattered more than an apology would have. Tobias Brooks heard about the report and the sheriff's visit from Russell Crane before she had a chance to tell him herself, which meant that, when he came to find her at the Sinclair cabin on the 4th day after the rescue, he came knowing the full shape of what she had done, not just the rescue but the months of careful, deliberate work that had preceded it. The professional case she had been building with full awareness that it was threatening to powerful interests in the valley, and that those interests had been working against her. She heard hooves in the yard and looked out the frost-edged window to see him dismounting, moving more slowly than usual from the residual stiffness of his injuries, but moving under his own power, which was all she had asked of the situation. She opened the door before he knocked. He stood on her step in the cold morning light, hat in his hands, and the expression on his face was the one she had been thinking about since the linta, that raw, open quality that the fever and the extremity had exposed, which she had half expected to see replaced by the more habitual reserve once he was back on his own feet. But it was still there. Looking at her across the threshold, he made no attempt to conceal it. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "without a fever in the way." "You've been thanking me," she said, "through everyone who comes to tell me what you said to them." He almost smiled at that. "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came in and she made coffee the way she made it, strong and black, and they sat at her small table with the survey map still spread across it and the fire warm against the winter outside, and they talked. Not about the rescue this time. Not about the survey or Price's crimes or the legal process in motion. They talk the way 2 people talk when they have separately arrived at the understanding that the other person is someone they would like to know better, and the talking itself becomes a kind of mutual discovery. She learned that he had come to Sweetwater Valley 6 years ago from Texas, that he had built the ranch from a starting point of 200 acres and 36 cattle with nothing but work and patience, and the particular stubbornness she was beginning to understand was one of his defining characteristics. She learned that he had been briefly married at 24 to a woman named Clara who had died of typhoid fever the second winter on the ranch, before the house was properly finished, and that he had grieved her in the private way she recognized from her own experience, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the deep, sustained quiet of someone who has sustained a loss they will carry always. She learned that he had no children, that this was a sorrow he had made his peace with in some ways and in other ways had not, that he had spent 10 years building something he had initially imagined building with someone else, and had found, after some years, that the work itself had become its own kind of company. She told him about Callum, about the Crestfall Pass survey and the fever that came after, and the 5 months she had carried their child, and the winter she lost both in the same terrible season. She told him about the 2 years of rebuilding herself, not as a victim of grief, but as someone who had found, in the act of returning to work, a thread back to herself that she had not known she was at risk of losing. She told him about the satisfaction of the work itself, not just its outcomes, the maps and the legal documents and the resolved disputes, but the actual physical and intellectual act of reading a landscape, of understanding a piece of the Earth's surface so completely that you could render it in lines and numbers with sufficient accuracy that other people could make real, safe decisions from your rendering. She had tried to explain this to people before and usually found their eyes glazing with polite incomprehension. Tobias Brooks listened with the particular attentiveness of someone to whom this made complete and immediate sense. "You see it differently than most people," he said. "The land, you see the structure of it." "I always have," she said. "I could not explain to you when it started. It simply always was." "I understand that," he said quietly. "I see cattle the same way. Not just what they are at a given moment, but where they are going to be, what they are going to do. Some people think it's experience, but I had it before I had experience. It's a kind of reading." "Yes," she said, and the word carried more than agreement. It carried the recognition of being understood in a specific way by someone who was not trying to understand you out of obligation, but because they genuinely could. They sat for a long time over the coffee, and outside the valley lay in its white silence, the blizzard's fury spent, the sun moving in a low winter arc that threw long blue shadows across the snow. Compass, her dog, had come in from the cold and was lying across Tobias's feet in the particular unprompted declaration of allegiance that dogs make, and Tobias had reached down without comment to scratch behind the dog's ears, and then left his hand resting there in the casual ease of a man who was simply comfortable where he was. When he finally rose to leave, he stood at the door for a moment with his hat in his hands again and said, "Your contract with Patterson will be finished soon." "In the spring," she said, "once the snow breaks enough to do the final verification survey." And after that, he was looking at her directly but without pressure, asking a genuine question. "I haven't decided," she said, which was technically true. She had not decided, though she had been deciding something in the back of her mind since she sat in a lean-to in a blizzard watching a man breathe and feeling that small, warm thing in her chest that she had been carefully not examining. He nodded. "There are other surveys needed in this valley," he said, "and in the valleys east of here. Good work for someone who does it as well as you do." "Is that an argument for staying?" she asked. The almost smile again, deeper this time. "I suppose it might be." He left, and she stood in the doorway watching him ride back down the snow-covered lane toward the road, and Compass came to sit beside her and leaned against her leg, and she reached down and put her hand on the dog's warm, solid back and breathed the cold mountain air and let herself, finally, examine the thing she had been carrying since the lean-to. She was falling in love with Tobias Brooks. It was not the wild, sudden fall she had experienced with Callum at 22. That had been the fall of someone who had not yet learned what love cost, who had given herself over to it with the reckless joy of the genuinely young. This was something quieter and more serious, and, she thought, more equal. This was two people who had both loved deeply and lost that love and survived it, who both carried the weight of grief as a permanent fact of their interior landscape, who both had found in work and solitude a sufficient life, and were now standing at the threshold of the understanding that sufficient was not the same as complete. She was frightened by it in the way she was frightened by very little, which was to say that the fear registered clearly, and she paid it its due attention, and then she decided what she was going to do about it. Winter settled into the valley with the slow patience of the truly inevitable. She worked on her report and her documentation. She visited the schoolhouse on Tuesdays when Francis Adler held a reading circle that had expanded to include several adults who had not had much formal schooling, and whom Wilhelmina found she was glad to sit beside. She became, in the way that the specific and necessary become, a part of Hartwell's fabric, not integrated in the seamless way of someone who had always belonged there, but present in the way of someone who was learning the fit of a new place and finding, with some surprise, that the fit was good. Tobias came to call twice more in January. The visits had the careful quality of the beginning of something, the mutual awareness of two people who were drawn together, and were being honest enough with themselves to acknowledge it and careful enough with each other not to rush it. They rode out together once in late January, when a break in the weather made it possible, following the creek line on horseback through the snow-covered valley, and talking about everything and nothing, and occasionally falling into a comfortable silence that was its own kind of statement. He told her things he did not typically tell people, about the loneliness of the ranch in winter, which he had learned to manage but never fully eliminated. About the way he still sometimes set 2 coffee cups in the morning from habit and then stopped, which was the kind of small, honest revelation that a man does not share unless he trusts the listener. About his feelings regarding the land itself, the way he had come to feel about the Sweetwater Valley as his place in the world, not as property exactly, but as the landscape he had fitted himself to, the place where his own shape and the shape of the land had grown into alignment over years. She listened to all of it, she shared in return. And riding back to Hartwell in the late afternoon, with the winter sun turning the snow to rose and gold, she was aware of the warmth of him riding beside her, and the way the valley looked from horseback with someone you were glad to be riding with. And she understood that she had not made any decision at all, that the decision had been made in her somewhere in the lean-to on the first night, and what she was doing since then was simply catching up to it. February brought a thaw, followed by another hard week of cold, followed by the first tentative warmth of approaching spring. She completed her final verification survey in early March, confirming every finding of her preliminary work, and submitted the completed report to Patterson and to the county recorder's office. It was, professionally speaking, among the best work she had ever done, precise, thorough, defensible, and consequential. The land of the Sweetwater Valley would be mapped correctly from now on, and the people who lived on it would know where their boundaries truly lay. Hector Price's legal settlement was finalized in March. He paid what he owed. The boundary markers were relocated under the supervision of Sheriff Kell and witnessed by Russell Crane and Pete Harmon and several others. The day it was done, Wilhelmina rode out to watch the final marker being reset in its correct position, and she stood in the cold spring mud and looked at the marker and felt the clean, complete satisfaction of work that had mattered being truly finished. Tobias was there too. She had not arranged this. They had both simply come to see the thing concluded. He stood beside her in the mud, his shoulder close to hers, watching the marker being tamped into place, and when it was done he looked at her with that expression she had come to know, the one that was not quite a smile but was entirely warm. "It's done," he said. "It is," she said. "What you built here will stay," he said. Long after we're both gone, the survey, the records, the maps, That's not nothing. It was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, which was not a category she would have expected to think about in that moment, which was exactly why it landed the way it did, directly, without defense, in the center of her chest. She looked at him. He looked at her. Around them, the others were moving, dispersing, heading back to their horses and their work and their lives, and the two of them stood still in the spring mud at the edge of a correctly placed boundary marker. "Stay," he said. One word. Simple, direct, leaving no ambiguity about what he meant. "I was already staying," she said. "I've been already staying for a while." He exhaled slowly, and in that exhale she could hear the weight of what it had cost him to ask, the man who had lost his wife and spent 10 years building alone, who had not asked anything of anyone since Clara died, asking now. Not the ranch, not the partnership, not anything practical. Just stay. Just be here, as though the rest of it would follow naturally from that one commitment which she believed it would. "I'll need to establish a proper office," she said, because she was Wilhelmina Rourke and she was a professional, and the practical things were important to her. "And I'll want to continue taking survey contracts. This work is mine and I don't intend to stop." "I know that," he said, with a complete absence of the hesitation or deflection that lesser men might have offered. "I would not want you to stop. The valley needs what you do. Other valleys need it." A pause. "I would like to watch you work for as long as you'll allow me to." "That's a considerable commitment," she said. "I'm aware," he said, and the almost smile became an actual smile, the first full one she had seen from him. And it was, she thought, rather extraordinary on his face, transforming the rugged severity into something that was still strong but also simply and genuinely happy. "All right," she said. He reached out and took her hand. His enormous, work-hardened hand that had adjusted its grip for her on the day they met, wrapped around hers with the same careful gentleness, and they stood there in the March mud of the Sweetwater Valley with the correctly placed boundary marker beside them and the first real warmth of spring tentatively in the air. And it was nothing like the grand, romantic gestures of novels, and it was everything. The spring moved forward with the momentum of the relieved and the alive. Hartwell had its first proper spring dance in April, held in the schoolhouse with the desks pushed back and a fiddle, and a mandolin and dancing that was energetic and slightly chaotic and altogether wonderful. Tobias danced with Wilhelmina twice, and the second time the valley watched them with the particular warm attention of a community that has decided it approves of something. And Francis Adler caught Wilhelmina's eye over Tobias's shoulder and gave her a smile that said, "We see you, and we are glad." She moved out of the Sinclair cabin in May and into a cottage that Patterson helped her arrange to rent at the northern edge of Hartwell, closer to the main ranch roads and more suitable as an office base. She put up a shingle, Rourke survey, and land documentation. Within a month, she had 3 new contracts from surrounding valleys. Within 3 months, she had more work than she could complete alone and had begun the process of hiring an assistant, a young man named Thomas Lark who was fresh from a technical school in Denver and who had an excellent mathematical mind and the crucial quality of being genuinely teachable. Tobias came to her office frequently in those months, ostensibly on business, but actually to see her, and they both knew it. He would sit across the long table covered in maps and ask questions about her current work that were genuine questions, not pretexts, and she would explain what she was finding, and he would listen and occasionally say something that revealed the quality of his observation of the land around him in a way that surprised and delighted her. He saw things she hadn't noticed. The way a particular drainage cut suggested an underground spring. The reason a certain hillside had different grass than the surrounding land. He had been reading the land for 30 years in a different language than hers, and the translation between their 2 ways of knowing was endlessly interesting to both of them. In July, on a warm evening when they had ridden out to the south end of the valley, ostensibly to check a marker she had placed earlier in the week, and actually to be alone together in the beautiful summer air with the valley spread below them and the peaks glowing in the late light, he kissed her. It was not impulsive. Nothing about Tobias Brooks was impulsive. He had been moving toward this with the same deliberate patience he brought to everything, waiting for the moment when it was right, and when it was right he acted. He turned to her with the full, clear intention of a man who has decided, and she leaned toward him with the full, clear intention of a woman who had decided considerably earlier, and had been waiting with something like amused patience for him to arrive at the same place. The kiss was gentle and sure and lasted a long time, and when it ended they were both still, looking at each other in the evening light, and she thought, "This is it. This is the true thing." Not the memory of Callum, which she would carry always and which was its own sacred permanent thing, but this present, breathing, beautiful thing with this man who had surprised her from the beginning and continued to surprise her. This was also true and also real and also permanent in the way that real love is permanent even when you do not yet know how it will end. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "since approximately the second time I saw you work." She laughed, which was not the response most novels would have scripted for this moment, but it was the honest one. "The boundary survey," she said, "that long day in October. You set up the theodolite and you looked through it and you made a note in that leather book of yours," he said, "and then you looked up and you just knew. You knew the measurement before you done the calculation. I could see it in your face, and I thought, that is not a thing that can be taught." She remembered the moment. She remembered being aware of his attention and choosing to ignore it or trying to. "It rattled me," she admitted, "being watched that carefully by someone I didn't know." "Did it?" he said, and there was something genuinely pleased in his voice. "Do not look so satisfied about it," she said. "I am satisfied about it," he said simply, and he smiled at her again, and she thought, "I am going to be seeing that smile for the rest of my life, and I am glad." They were married in September, 10 months after the blizzard that had locked down the valley and set in motion everything that followed. The wedding was in the church with the leaning steeple, which the valley had straightened in the spring with the combined labor of a dozen volunteers who had arrived one Saturday morning with tools and determination, and which now stood properly upright over the ceremony. Francis Adler read a poem. Russell Crane stood with Tobias in the capacity of best man and maintained his composure admirably until the moment the ring went on Wilhelmina's finger, at which point he turned his face briefly toward the back of the church for reasons that everyone politely decided not to notice. Hector Price was not there. His departure from the valley in August had been quiet and final. He had sold his ranch to a family from Kansas named Garfield and moved on, taking his grievances and his small calculating meanness with him, and the valley had breathed slightly easier in his absence, the way a room breathes easier when a source of bad air is removed. Wilhelmina Rourke became Wilhelmina Brooks on record, though she kept Rourke as her professional name because it was on 3 years of survey work and switching it in mid-career would have been practically inconvenient, and Tobias had said immediately and without any suggestion of wounded pride, "Of course, that's your work's name. Keep it." Which was, she told Francis Adler later, perhaps the most romantic thing a man in the Colorado Territory had said in 1879, which Francis Adler had laughed about for some time. They moved into the ranch together in October, and she brought her maps and her equipment and her books and Compass the dog, and the long, low house on the Brooks Ranch became home in the way she had not known a place since the farmhouse in Pennsylvania where she had grown up fully, without reservation, with the settled knowledge of belonging. The life they built together was not simple. There was hard work always. The survey business grew and demanded more of her time and energy, sometimes pulling her away from the ranch for days at a time when distant contracts required field work, and she missed him in those absences with a directness that she found she did not try to diminish or manage but simply felt. The ranch demanded its own constant labor, and the Colorado Territory in the early 1880s was a place of expanding economic pressure, with the railroad coming through in patterns that changed land values and grazing rights and everything dependent on them. They navigated all of it together, bringing their two ways of reading the world, his deep practical knowledge of the land as a living working system, her technical precision in documenting and measuring it, into a partnership that was useful and also good, in the way that the best marriages are useful and also good. She told him she was pregnant in December of their first married year, a year after the blizzard, sitting at the same kitchen table where they had drunk coffee on the day he had come to thank her properly. She told him quietly and watched his face do something that she would think about for a long time afterward, move through a sequence of emotions with unusual swiftness. From the first surprised stillness through something she recognized as the careful guarding against hope of someone who had lost before, through the undeniable emergence of real joy, a deep and private joy that was his alone, and that he made no attempt to conceal from her. He stood up from the table and came around to her and put his arms around her very gently and held her for a long time without speaking, and she felt the steadiness of him and the warmth of him and the fierce, quiet love that was his characteristic way of being in the world, and she put her hands over his and they stood in the kitchen in the winter morning light. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "You'll tell me if you need anything." "I will," she said. "I always tell you what I need." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You do," he said. "That is one of the many things I love about you." The pregnancy progressed through the winter and into spring, and she worked throughout it with modifications she judged sensible and modifications she rejected as unnecessary, much to the mild exasperation of the valley's women, who offered advice in the generous collective way of frontier communities and did not always receive the responses they expected. Frances Adler, who had become her closest friend in Hartwell, took the somewhat more useful approach of asking what Wilhelmina actually needed rather than telling her what she should need, which Wilhelmina appreciated enormously. Thomas Lark, her assistant, took on more of the field work in the final months of the pregnancy, proving himself more capable than she had expected. She supervised from the office, reviewing his data with the practiced eye that caught anything that needed correction and finding, to her genuine pleasure, that he needed less correction as the months went on. She was building something that would last, she thought, not just the maps and the records and the documented boundaries of the Sweetwater Valley and the surrounding territory, but a practice, a professional legacy that would continue even through the seasons when her own direct participation was limited. The child came in August, on a morning when the valley was at its most beautiful, the summer grasses golden and the creek running clear and the peaks sharp against an azure sky. A boy, big, dark-haired, with his father's jaw already evident in a face that was otherwise still the soft, unformed face of a newborn, and with Wilhelmina's dark eyes, which Tobias pointed out immediately and with visible pride. They named him Callum Rourke Brooks, which had been Wilhelmina's suggestion, and which Tobias had accepted without hesitation or qualification, understanding completely what it meant and honoring it. Callum, who had been Wilhelmina's first great love and would be remembered in this second great life she was building, carried forward in the name of the son that Tobias and she had made together. There were people in the valley who thought it an unusual choice, and she did not explain it to those people, because it was not for them. She stood in the yard of the ranch on the morning of Callum's first week, holding him in the cool morning air, looking out across the valley that she had mapped so carefully, the valley whose every contour and water source and boundary line she could reconstruct in her mind as clearly as her own handwriting. Tobias came to stand beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the solidity of him. "I mapped this valley," she said quietly, looking out at the landscape in the early light, "and then I ended up belonging to it." "I think it was the other way around," he said. "I think the valley belongs to you." She considered this. "That is not how surveying works," she said. "I know," he said, "but it's how this works." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the morning light was on both of them, and the baby was warm in her arms, and the valley lay around them in all its difficult, beautiful, indifferent reality. And it was, she thought, enough. It was more than enough. It was the closed and complete and abundant thing that she had not known she was still capable of wanting until she had been standing in a blizzard, rope in her frostbitten hands, refusing to let go. 2 years passed with the rhythm of a life well constructed. The survey business expanding steadily, Thomas Lark growing into something close to a partner in everything but formal title, Callum learning to walk in the spring mud of the ranch yard, and developing opinions about horses that were both vocal and consistent. Wilhelmina published her first technical paper in the Colorado School of Mines Quarterly, a piece on survey methodology in mountainous terrain that received more attention than she expected from the professional community, and led to correspondence with 2 other surveyors in the territory, one of whom came out to meet her in the spring and spent 3 days in her office looking at her methods and asking excellent questions. She found, to her slight surprise, that she enjoyed the intellectual exchange of professional equals, had not realized until she had it again how much she had missed it since working alongside Callum. Tobias read the paper, slowly and with care, asking her to explain 2 passages where the technical language moved past what he could follow without assistance. She explained them at the kitchen table with diagrams she drew on scrap paper, and he understood, and he said, "They will be teaching this method in 20 years. They may already be teaching a version of it in some places," she said. "Your version is better," he said, with the calm certainty of a man who has no doubt about this. She loved him with a completeness that included this, his complete absence of doubt about her work, his bedrock certainty in her competence that was not performance or support in the self-congratulatory sense that men sometimes offered their wives' achievements, but was simply fact, the way the topography of the valley was fact. It was there. It was real. He would not pretend otherwise. In the autumn of their 3rd married year she began to suspect she was pregnant again, which proved correct. She told Tobias over breakfast, and he received the news with the same quality of careful joy he had brought to Callum's announcement, perhaps slightly more immediately accessible this time, the guard against hope not quite as high because he had proof now that hope was warranted. "Another summer baby, I think," she said. "August again, possibly July." "The ranch will manage," he said. "The ranch always manages," she said. "That is one of the things I respect about it." He smiled at that. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture so habitual now that it was both intimate and utterly easy, the gesture of 2 people who had been reaching for each other long enough that the reaching required no more thought than breathing. The 2nd child was born in July, 2 weeks earlier than she had expected, arriving with an urgency that made even Frances Adler, who was serving as the attending practical nurse, draw a short breath. She was a girl, dark-eyed, loud-voiced from the first moment, already making her opinions known about the inconvenience of the world, which Tobias observed with an expression of complete affection. They named her Clara Wilhelmina Brooks, which had been Tobias's quiet suggestion one evening, and which Wilhelmina had accepted with an understanding that moved her deeply. Clara for his first love, the woman who had shared the terrible first winter on this land and had not lived to see what it became. 2 histories carried forward in 2 names, 2 great losses honored in the children who came after. Callum, who was nearly 2, was fascinated and slightly suspicious of his sister, regarding her from a distance with the focused assessment of someone taking in new survey data. He would eventually, all evidence suggested, become devoted to her. But he required a period of evaluation first, which everyone in the family found endearing. The autumn of that year brought a final resolution that Wilhelmina had been waiting for since the boundary dispute first surfaced. The territorial court issued a formal ruling on the record of Hector Price's boundary manipulations, officially documenting the fraud and establishing the corrected survey data as the legal record of the valley's land ownership. Her name was on the documentation. Her methodology was cited in the ruling. Sheriff Kell sent her a letter notifying her of the outcome, with a dryness that she recognized as his version of high praise. "Your work proved sufficient for the purpose." She showed the letter to Tobias that evening, and he read it and set it down on the table, and then he looked at her with that expression she had been reading for 3 years now, the one that combined respect and affection and something she thought might simply be wonder. "They almost stopped you from doing this," he said. "Price, the contract cancellation attempt." "They did not stop me," she said. "No," he said, "they didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking. There is a larger survey project that has come to my attention. The territory is beginning the process of establishing formal county boundaries east of here, and the bid for the survey contract is open. It would be large work. It would take time, but I think you should submit for it." She looked at him. "That would take me away from the ranch for extended periods." "I know," he said. "I'll manage. Russell will manage. Thomas will manage." He met her eyes steadily. "That work needs doing, and nobody in this territory is better positioned to do it than you. The documentation of Sweetwater Valley is proof of that. The court just said so in those exact words." She thought about it. She thought about the scale of it, the sweep of new territory, the intellectual challenge of a project larger than anything she had undertaken alone, the contribution it would make to the formal legal foundation of the land, a contribution that would matter for generations, the kind of work that outlasted its maker. "It would mean more time away," she said again, not as a reluctance but as a practicality to be examined. "You'll come home," he said simply. "I will always come home," she said. "Then submit for it," he said. She submitted the contract bid in November, with a detailed proposal that took her 2 weeks to write, and that Thomas Lark helped compile, and that drew on every piece of professional documentation she had built since arriving in the Colorado Territory 6 years earlier. It was thorough. It was honest. It was ambitious in the way that only genuinely good work can afford to be ambitious, because it made promises that were based on demonstrated ability rather than aspiration. She received the contract award in January. The evening she received the letter confirming the award, Tobias poured 2 glasses of the good whiskey he kept for occasions that warranted it, and they sat at their kitchen table in the warm lamplight with Callum asleep down the hall and Clara already developing the firm opinions about bedtime that would characterize her personality, and they drank to it. "To the survey of record," he said. "To the valley," she said, "where none of this would have happened." He looked at her over his glass. "To the blizzard," he said quietly. She met his eyes, the blizzard that had locked the valley, the rope in her frostbitten hands, the lean-to in the firelight, and the breathing of a man she barely knew whose survival she had organized with the same precision she brought to everything, because she had looked at the evidence and known, and refused to stand still. "To the blizzard," she said. They drank. Outside, the Colorado winter pressed against the thick walls of the house, and the valley lay in its winter silence, its boundaries correctly marked and documented, its history written in the lines and numbers of her maps that would sit in the county recorder's office for generations to come. Inside, the fire burned steadily. Compass twitched in his sleep in front of the hearth, and Tobias reached across the table and took her hand as he had been taking her hand for 3 years, without hesitation, with the full certainty of a man who knows where he belongs. Wilhelmina Rourke Brooks, surveyor of the Colorado Territory, organizer of rescues, mapper of places that had existed in fact but not yet in record, held his hand and felt the whole solid, complete, irreplaceable fact of her life surrounding her. Not the life she had planned, not the life she had expected after grief. The life she had built piece by careful piece, with the same rigor and honesty she brought to everything she made. The ranch, the work, the children sleeping down the hall, and this man, this enormous, careful, honest, surprising man who had looked at her work and simply seen it for what it was and never once suggested it should be something smaller. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The winter outside was deep and still and cold, and inside the Sweetwater Valley ranch house the fire burned and the family was complete, and Wilhelmina Rourke looked at the life she had built on accurate foundations and found not a single line that needed correction.